So today we will be doing female reproductive grossing using an apple. So you can actually do this right at home if you want to. Taking a piece of apple, we will be making a LEEP specimen as well as a cone specimen. These are probably the most common cervical specimens you'll get in order to assess cervical dysplasia. Now when you're doing a LEEP, we want that to be very superficial, so it has a very minimal depth to it, and I'm just going to make a kind of a small shave here, and we're going to treat the skin of the apple like the ectocervical mucosa right there. Okay, so I'm actually going to put a little hole in there to make my ectocervical os, and then we just have this nice little saucered skin for our LEEP. Now the cone, what you're going to want to do is you're going to actually dig into the stroma of the apple, and we can actually cone it out, so feel free to get in there a little bit deeper with your blade, your scalpel, your knife, whatever you have at home. All right, so now we have our cone, and I'm going to go ahead and put a little hole in the middle to make our endocervical canal. There it is. So again, we have ectocervical mucosa is the skin of the apple. We have the ectocervical rim, which is the edge of that mucosa. And then we have the stroma, which is all the parenchymal component of the cervix. You'll have your endocervical margin, which is going to be the end of the endocervical canal. And so we'll come back and we'll look at these specimens individually as we gross them. But that's the easy way to make your LEEP and your cone. And I'm actually going to trim up my LEEP just a smidge here. You don't get to do this with real surgical specimens, but this will make demonstrating it a little bit more practical. Okay, so we'll get rid of those little pieces. Now I'm going to go ahead and ink both specimens. It'll just make things a little bit easier. Now typically you can shoot for 3 colors, especially when you're doing a cone. But sometimes LEEPs you can get away with just using 1 color, especially if they're received unoriented and fragmented. It's easy to just find your non-mucosal surface and ink everything 1 color. So I'm going to ink my stromal surface black in this case. And to demonstrate the rest of the inking, I'm actually going to go ahead and I'll add my ectocervical margin on this. It doesn't really become practical to ink the endocervical margin, but you could do that on your LEEP if you wish. So I'm going to actually take a blue and ink my rim. And so that's going to look like is at the edge of your ectocervical mucosa, you'll see this nice little blue trim. And that'll show you that that's a true margin. So again, we take a look. We have ectocervical mucosa is the skin of the apple, and then the stroma on the posterior side. Now I'm going to go ahead and ink the ectocervical mucosa margin on my cone right away. And I am bleeding my inks just a tad, but that's fine. I'll cover it up with my black ink. Okay. Now the other thing I can do with my cone specimen is I can actually apply a little bit of ink right at the opening of the endocervix and create an endocervical margin inking. And then I'll come in and ink the rest of the stroma, my black. You can get a little bit of overlay, but you want to make sure everything is completely inked on here. Okay, so I don't really have any more handy in my home laboratory. So we'll just go ahead and apply a little bit of dabbing to set that ink. Okay, so in my left hand I have LEEP, very small, thin specimen. In my right I have my cone, a little more 3-dimensional depth to it. Same basic concept. We're basically trying to eliminate the portion of ectocervical mucosa that potentially has some dysplasia, and then we can assess that. Okay. So first things first, let's do our LEEP specimen. So you can get these, it's not common for these to be received oriented. So go ahead and just describe what you see, and we're just going to end up submitting it entirely in general. So I will say there's a portion of cervical tissue measuring 1.8 by 1.6 by 0.2 centimeters, period. The ectocervical mucosa is tan, pink, and smooth, period. The resection margin is inked black, period. The specimen is radially sectioned and submitted entirely in cassettes A1 through A4. So when we're radially section this specimen, what we're going to do is basically think of it like a pizza or a pie. I usually like to make one single cut through the os and then another one. So I have it in 4 pieces, and then it becomes easier to take each piece and then radially section that. So 1, 2. Now you'll notice these kind of come out like triangles, and that's fine. If for some reason you do need to trim those up, just make sure you're putting the pieces kind of close together in the same cassette. But as you can see, there's just nothing too glamorous about these specimens. I'm going to try to keep the pieces as close to each other as possible. But the goal here, and you'll see it much better on the cone specimen, is to have whatever portion of endocervical canal in one slice, the stroma component, ectocervical mucosa on the bottom side, and I'll see if we can zoom this in. I don't think my camera's going to focus on something so itty bitty. And then the ectocervical margin on the back side here. And so then I'll just tell the histotext I want that submitted on edge, and I'm just going to submit it entirely here. And I can just do as many cassettes as needed to submit that. Again, the goal being to submit entirely. You want to be kind to your histotexts. Don't stuff your cassettes full of tissue. There's no reason to do that. It just makes it more tedious for them, for the pathologist. So just go ahead, just like that. Close that up, submit it entirely. Okay, let's move on to the cone. So here is our cervical cone. As you can see, it's got a little bit more depth to it. So we're going to start off the resection pretty much identical. Now, these might actually be oriented, and so it's not uncommon that you receive these specimens with either a suture or some sort of ink designating a 12 o'clock position or a 6 o'clock position. I'm actually going to go ahead and stick this little suture here as our designated 12 o'clock. Right? You can use a piece of ink to do the same. You may also receive these fragmented, but it's important to note that when you get this specimen, you designate whether it is oriented or unoriented. So I'm going to dictate received in formal and labeled with proper patient identification and open quote, cervical cone, close quote, is an oriented cervical cone specimen measuring 2.1 by 1.8 by 1.1 centimeters, period. There is a suture designating the 12 o'clock position, period. The ectocervical mucosa is, the ectocervical rim is inked blue. The endocervical margin is inked green, and the stromal margin is inked black, period. The mucosa is tan, pink, and granular, period. The specimen is radially sectioned and submitted entirely in cassettes A1 through A4 as follows, and then we'll go ahead and do that. So we're going to follow the same procedure we did for the LEEP, except now you really want to be extra cautious about how you maintain your specimen. So let's go ahead and find our opening, and I'm going to actually probe this. So if we see that our 12 o'clock is up here with the hole, kind of blurry for you guys, but hopefully you can see that. What I'm actually going to do is I like to, again, quadrisect this. I'll make a cut from 12 to 6, right in half, and try to make sure your orientation doesn't leave you. Oops, of course, it's going to bounce all over the place. So, again, we'll say 12, 6. That means this will be, if we were to reevaluate our face, that means 3 o'clock is actually going to be on my left side when we face the specimen down. So make sure you're keeping that straight. And it'll make a cut at the 3 o'clock side, and 9 o'clock will be on my right. So I want to submit this thing sequentially. So it's a little bit easier to cut, but also keep in mind you're still going to be dealing with those triangular shaped pieces. So knowing in my specimen, I'm going to separate it out a little bit, make it easier for you guys at home. Let's see here. Right there. All right. So 12 to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 9, 9 to 12. Now, when you submit these in a cassette, you don't have to maintain 100% perfect orientation. Okay, that's going to be difficult. But what I can do is, as I submit it and I dictate, I'm going to tell my dictation that A1 is my 12 to 3 o'clock component. And again, we're trying to make sure we include endocervical canal all the way to ectocervical mucosa. A2 is my 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock quadrant. Mind these little pieces. Coming around again, I need to get my 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock quadrant. Those, you'll notice, are a lot easier to embed on edge than it was for the LEEP. And then finally, my 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock. And don't be afraid, if you need to use more cassettes, you can always use more cassettes. It doesn't have to fit nicely into 4 cassettes like it does here. Sometimes you get small ones, sometimes you get large ones, sometimes you get partial ones. Sometimes you receive these fragmented, and if you receive a fragmented LEEP or cone, the best thing you can do is identify your ectocervical mucosa and then ink the opposite side, which would be your stroma. And if you can't really tell where the ectocervical rim is or the endocervical margin, don't worry about that so much, just ink everything in one color. But if they're intact, it makes it easier to ink those 3 colors that we already talked about. But you have it. Really some basic prosection here. These are pretty common specimens that you'll get. And the goal here is making sure you submit everything entirely. If you're worried about not being able to designate, like, oh, is that a 12 o'clock lesion or a 1 o'clock lesion, just note that they'll at least be able to identify the quadrant and localize it that way. And if there are malignancies detected, then chances are they're going to go back and do a more extensive surgery like a hysterectomy. So the goal here is you just want to verify the degree to that dysplasia is actually going. So that's it for our cervical cones and our LEEPs. Hopefully you enjoyed those. Feel free to practice at home.